Hey guys, Luton here. Welcome back for another episode of Below the Line. Now, last time we were talking about trainers. We were talking about external software, external games beyond the actual game itself that allows you to train up your skill, and whether or not people were seeing that as being a kind of, I don't know, cheaty, disdainful thing to do. George says, in my opinion, using a training program for anything is not particularly a bad thing. If somebody wants to improve on his aim and tracking skills without having to suffer from being killed over and over again by already experienced players who are going to simply destroy them on the spot and then having to leave the lobby, wait another 100 people to gather and round and then start another game, it's simply just not fun. It's a waste of time. I do really agree there. He says, for example, when I first started playing For Honor about 5 months after it came out, I tried to play online on Jules, and as I expected, I was destroyed. That is actually a thing which often is very off-putting about getting into games once they have released. You know there's going to be a lot of people that have just been sitting in that game from day one and just rinsing it, practicing over and over and over. Nothing wrong with that, but it is off-putting to think that you're going to have to deal with that when you know you're coming in with no experience at all. He says, after a whole week of simply not being able to win a single match, I was about to give up on it. But then I realised the game had a built-in practice mode where you and an AI character start an endless duel where if either of you die, you just respawn full health, allowing you to learn from your mistakes and learning more tricks for beating your opponent. Also, you can choose the difficulty of the AI at the start, so you can practice depending on what kind of level you think you can compete against. And let me tell you that level 3 is savage and unpredictable. It will never let you take an easy way to win against it. After I learned how my character truly works, I was able to win 5 matches in a row, not because I gained levels, but after gaining some actual fighting experience from good old-fashioned trial and error. As I said before, I was about to give up on playing that game, and so other players might think after they had no fun because of frustration, having to wait for a really long time to only then be killed in the first second of the match, those training programs can help new players understand the principles of the game better and also give them a fighting chance against the more experienced gamers. And I just thought this was a really well-rounded comment, just making a lot of good points, because it does really highlight not only the purpose of why it's a good idea for games to actually implement some kind of practice system in their game, but also why maybe, for example, something like PUBG. I bet PUBG could do very well from just having like a skirmish mode, where you basically just have one town, and kind of basically like a TDM or something along those lines, you know, except that it's, you know, it's still like one life only, just like in PUBG. You don't want to be able to just kind of just keep jumping back in again and again and again. You still have to queue up, but it just means that you essentially, it's just 2 teams, you know, and you could argue it could get a bit campy, but you know, it's kind of like, that's the whole point, you know, sometimes it can be a little bit like that. Maybe there's a very, maybe in that sort of mode you have a very slow encroaching circle or something along those lines that just kind of pushes people more towards actually getting together so it doesn't get too campy or whatever. But, you know, it just goes to highlight that, you know, there is definite reasons, as you know, stated by George in his kind of experiences, as to why it's very worthwhile taking the time to practice up. And, you know, things like fighting games, for example. Fighting games always had like practice modes so you could learn the characters, learn the moves, get better and stuff like that. Armor or anything like that, I mean, you can just go into the editor and you can just practice yourself and do these kind of things. It's not the kind of game which really requires it. But, you know, we look at other FPS, stuff like Battlefield or whatever, really, just any kind of like online shooter. You're always going to be able to just jump in a game, get straight in the action, so you never have that thing. But PUBG is kind of like one of these unusual things where you might actually go long periods without actually getting any gunplay. So unless you're literally playing day after day after day after day after day, and I don't think it's fair really to say like, oh, you know, if you want to get good, you just got to play more. Some people don't have that option, and is it really fair that they just don't get that ability, that time in the game? You know, it's not their fault if they have to work or do things. People have real life, and it's just kind of like, you know, so what, are you doomed to just be constantly screwed over by other people because they just happen to be in the position where they're able to play endlessly? That doesn't seem like a really good concept for a game, because again, that's surely a way to just make people get pissed off and think, oh fuck this, I'm going to go do something else, which is their prerogative. Okay, some people a lot more to the point as well. Raging Gamer just says, how is it moral or unethical to practice? Should NFL players never practice too? How do you think people get good? Sure as shit not practicing. Is it a stupid waste of money? Yes, but it's not hurting anyone but themselves, so how is it wrong? Again, I think a little bit of debate there. I wouldn't say it's completely useless, but, you know, again, to the point and completely correct. Okay, Jiro comes in for us again, says, I would say personally it is a waste of money. Using an external program to practice for a video game should only exist if A, it was made by the people who made the game, and B, was free or very, very cheap. I think it was very, very cheap compared to the base game, as it's basically a practice mode separate from the game. I can see it's being useful, but as said, it's basically a practice mode for the game, and most companies aren't going to put extra work into the game. Well, they should, basically. They just should. Some do though, like with Arma, since with Zeus you can place down AI on map. It's different though because Arma's a sandbox, it's not like a standalone sort of format, do you know what I mean? Given patrol, which you can set up practice missions, yeah, as I said. He says, however, if it's a third-party program that's made by the people who made the game, how helpful can it be? Unless it replicates all the physics and mechanics hidden away under the game's source code, which might be illegal to open and look at copy in the first place, it's not going to be perfect. And as you pointed out, OT, it would be much better to just play another game you already own or one of the free-to-play shooters instead. There isn't much practice to get except learning the maps, which you can learn much better by actually playing the maps, unless you play a lot of shooters and know map designs well enough to spot choke holds and flanking positions, at which point you don't need to practice very much. Either way, it's a very subjective situation, but here's what to think about. If you run into a brick wall enough times, eventually you learn to go around it. But if you play in an environment where you can't be harmed or challenged and can just make a brick wall not appear at all or instantly give yourself the solution without earning it, are you actually getting any better? Or are you just making the trainer easier and thus actually limiting yourself instead of improving? I don't know. It's difficult to say, isn't it, really? I mean, it just depends on how, yeah, like we say, how true to the trainer it actually is. But I think for me personally, I think that there's always going to be something to take away from these kind of trainer elements. You get something out of it. It's just difficult to quantify like how much you would get out of it, how beneficial it actually is. And also, I think genuinely from the developer's point of view, if someone is kind of replicating your game to a very high degree, even if it's not replicating all the physics and you know, bullet drop trajectories and all these kind of things that you have in the game, maybe it's more around the point of just kind of your general awareness, sharpen up your awareness or something like this. I think you can get something out of it, but again, I think generally it's maybe not worth it. It'd be so much better if the actual devs themselves bothered to put something like that in the game. I think people would get a hell of a lot more out of it. Lorby says, I don't see a difference from this to reading up on chess tactics, for instance, from having a practice match with friends, or even just study others' play styles. I honestly don't even understand why somebody could have a problem with this. Well, again, that's because the gaming media always have a reason to find fault with something. And he says, if it is because it's an external paid software, then the fault, in my opinion, lies with the creator of the game in the first place. Why is there no bot mode? That would be what got on my nerves. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's why I think it becomes so abundantly clear that there is a demand for kind of like a practice mode for something like PUBG. And so I don't think it's required for every single game, but I think, you know, it's just highlighted that it's something people want because of the sparse, sporadic nature of the contact and the engagement you actually have in that game. And for some people, you know, they can go charging in, find the action straight away. I don't think it's always that hard to get the action, but I think it's the waiting time in terms of setting up. You know, you have to wait a long time to get into a game. And then, yeah, if you just, you know, if you're starting out new, you get unlucky a few times. I can understand why they would get an irritating grind, and people want to kind of practice that a little bit. You know, I suppose, you know, patience is a virtue, and, you know, going over it again and again and just learning and learning and learning is part of it. And maybe the frustration, you could argue the frustration actually does make for, you know, it kind of makes you take things on board a little bit better, but I don't know. I just think it would be beneficial if they put something like that into the game, like a skirmish mode or whatever. Okay, Delta says, I used to play sport, in particular AFL, which is Australian Football League. We had a single game a week and trained twice a week. Those were the times that we honed our skills and put them to the test. Of course, we could improve outside these times by doing simple tasks or activities that helped improve skills such as bouncing a ball and improving our kicks. These activities were often repeatable actions. Now, a game would only last for about an hour and a half, hardly enough time to hone skill while playing. The game was further broken up into 4 quarters, and just because you were at the game, it didn't even mean that you'd be on the field for the entire time. So how is that really any different to training and practicing? And this is an incredibly good point to make. Let's say game day equates to a match of PUBG. Load screens are the quarters and actual gameplay relies on your skills and your knowledge. If you need the extra practice because you're not on the field the whole time or you get killed early on, what is wrong with that? Personally, I really don't see an issue with this. It's just another method of practice. You could apply the same concept to just about any skill. And this is exactly, you know, it's just a very well made point. And you know, something I said in my video, and I think a few people were saying, was like, well, you can go into these trainers, you can go and do these practices, but it doesn't actually help you really learn what it's actually like to play, say, PUBG or whatever. Because in PUBG, you're playing against real players, and real players are going to do different things, they're going to outplay you, whatever, okay? But here's the thing, just like practicing for football, when you're practicing those fundamental ball handling skills or whatever, those are like your fundamental base foundation skills, right? Like getting onto a target, whatever. Now look, you know, in the past, I actually would sometimes go into, like, back in the day, right, I would actually go into games and I would sort of run around in blank maps and I would kind of imagine situations where I might encounter players, and I would sort of practice up my sort of aiming on objects around the map, or I would sort of practice how quickly I could scope up on things, you know? So it's kind of like that. You're practicing those fundamental skills so that when you actually do get into a game, just like I was saying before, how I would sometimes play a more hardcore game like Verdun or whatever, which is really like high damage model. Then you come into something like Battlefield and suddenly, bang, you feel like you're a lot sharper than you were before. Now, you weren't playing that same game and you weren't playing against the same player mindset or whatever, but you were basically getting your mechanical skills kind of a little better, a little bit more sharpened up, so that when you actually bring that into the game, and that's very different, it's very similar, sorry, to exactly what you're doing with sports stuff, where you're basically practicing those fundamental skills, so that when you actually bring it into the game versus other people, you've got that locked down. And that's what really the deal is with these practice systems, with these trainers. Okay, it's not about you necessarily practicing the exact same situations that you might have in the game itself. It's just about you sort of learning, basically, and getting those fundamentals put away. Okay, last one to Kev says, love the idea of PUBG Trainer that works well. I totally get that the game includes the fact that people have to put the time in to get good, but that time isn't available to me. I wouldn't call skipping that time as an unfair advantage. I've been playing FPS. I wouldn't say you'd be skipping the time even. I've been playing FPS games since the 90s. I don't need the training to replicate how people act, but I do need to practice the mechanics of the game, just like we were saying, including the map layouts. Those who complain about this training are akin to people who jumped into a Ponzi scheme and complain that new people aren't jumping on board to get ripped off. If you're 12 and you spent 40 hours a week in a game, and then you complain somebody who's 45 and can only spend 3 hours a week wants to practice offline, then complain all you want, but you don't have a clue. And again, absolutely just on point. So now we come to part 2 of Below the Line. This is where I pose a question for you guys to discuss down below, and then we look at the comments next week. This one, we're talking about team switching. Is mid-round team switching ever okay? Now wait, before you answer immediately, Battlefield 1 CTE branch recently stated that it's testing out a system whereby people can be switched mid-round. Now, to be clear, I was speaking with Matt W., a level designer at EA DICE via Twitter, who I think is championing the concept, or at least sort of pitched it. He was clear that players who are contributing and doing well shouldn't be among those getting switched around. Fair enough. But even if that's the case, will people be happy about forcibly being made to switch sides? I'm going to just assume not. It's not clear though currently if this will be only applied to people who are just joining into a game. It also, I suspect, will not forcibly split apart people joining as part of a pre-made squad, which is usually what can devastatingly unbalance the side, as we've seen before, when you're doing well only for your team to suddenly have a whole squad join, which basically ruins your chance of keeping things under control if you're on a server that isn't fully populated. So the real question here is, should you be switched between sides ever? Well, Battlefield games have often had some kind of team balancing post-game, and it's not a new concept for any number of games to try and balance people based on their general performance. Here's the thing though, in my experience of hosting specifically Battlefield games, I find that round to round, you usually only need to move maybe 1 or 2 people to actually balance a game, or at least make it come back to being somewhat more challenging. Moving more people than this is usually just a jumble, and it can make things sometimes worse, or just flip the other way, where the one side just becomes OP then. Also, if this change plans to move people who are not contributing or doing well near the top of the board, it's barely even going to do anything. If it's just switching people who just joined, they're probably going to get moved to a losing side, think, oh, fuck this, and then just leave. If it's moving people mid-game, that's obviously going to then annoy people, and while those players may not be the top of the table, there's still a physical presence on the field, and those people disappearing, or then, for example, maybe quitting out if they get switched, that's going to have an impact as well. Personally, I don't mind switching players around, but it should happen post or pre-match, or maybe organically as they join, so it doesn't feel like they're actively being torn from one side to another. It is questionable if this really is going to have a big, and if any, impact at all, but as a concept, do you want the game to decide, any game, to decide where you should be playing? I can just imagine that it doesn't sit well with people when that's going to happen mid-round. It certainly never did when I was moving people in my hosted games. So tell me what you think about this down below, mid-round team switching. Is it good, bad, or just don't care? This is LT guys, I'll see you next week for more Below the Line.